Some weapons are built to win without a body count. They target the mind, make enemies feel outnumbered, surrounded, or doomed, and they choose surrender as the safest path. That's not an accident, it's design. In this episode, we'll follow fear weapons across eras and see how noise, light, and spectacle become tools of control. The real battlefield starts in the imagination. Killing is expensive. It costs time, risk, and retaliation. Terror is cheaper if it works, because it moves people without touching them. A fear weapon tries to change the enemy's math, make resistance feel hopeless, and surrender feel rational. That's why intimidation often shows up when a commander wants quick control, not a long fight. But fear has side effects that can poison the future. Most fear tools feed three inputs into the human brain. Surprise steals time to think. Uncertainty makes people imagine the worst. Shame makes them hide mistakes instead of fixing them. If all three hit at once, coordination collapses fast. Fear is social. One flinch becomes 10. When people watch each other for danger cues, emotion becomes a network signal. A commander doesn't have to scare everyone, just enough to start the chain. Once the chain starts, the crowd does the rest. That's why intimidation is aimed at the tipping point. Armies don't collapse only from casualties. They collapse when morale breaks. Morale is the willingness to keep acting together under stress. Fear weapons aim at morale the way arrows aim at shields. When morale dips, orders arrive slower, mistakes multiply, and retreat becomes attractive. So commanders invented ways to push the morale meter down on purpose. The best fear weapon arrives before the army does: reputation. If the enemy believes you are unstoppable, they pay morale in advance. Stories travel faster than soldiers. A commander who controls the story can open gates without firing a shot. That is intimidation at maximum efficiency. Defenders always weigh two piles: risk and hope. Fear weapons add weight to risk and drain hope without changing reality. That distortion is the point. Once surrender feels safer than holding, the battle ends early. So intimidation is a kind of psychological engineering. Fear tools range from loud and theatrical to deeply cruel. In Tiny Titans, we focus on intimidation mechanisms, not harm. But history still forces a question. What's the line? When fear becomes policy, it can destroy trust and create cycles of revenge. Understanding the line helps us understand the cost. Across eras, the same fear ingredients repeat. Sound shocks the body, scale shocks the eyes, light shocks the senses, and messages shock trust. The technology changes, but the psychology stays familiar. In the next act, we start with the simplest tool: noise, because you can hear fear coming before you see it. Once commanders realized fear can be designed, they started building it on purpose. They chose instruments, costumes, animals, and signals that reshape the enemy's expectations. In other words, fear became a blueprint and a supply line. Next, we'll watch that blueprint in action with drums, horns, and synchronized steps. Noise is the oldest fear weapon because it's immediate and cheap. A drumbeat signals discipline and numbers, even if numbers are unknown. Horns stretch a formation's presence across valleys and hills. The enemy's body reacts first, heart rate up, thinking down. Sound turns waiting into dread. Humans fear coordination because it implies control. A messy mob looks beatable. A drilled line looks like a machine. Synchronized steps erase the hope of exploiting mistakes. That's why parade-like movement intimidates even before contact. The fear is, they won't break. Chants synchronize breathing, which steadies your own nerves. But to the enemy, a chant sounds like a single creature approaching. Repetition matters more than meaning. It's physiology, not poetry. When the chant arrives, imagination fills in the rest. The fear weapon is the rhythm itself. Standards are morale technology. They tell your troops where to look. They also tell the enemy what to fear. An identity that survives losses. A huge banner makes a force feel larger than it is, and it makes retreat feel like abandoning your own story. At night, you can't confirm what you hear. A drum in the dark can sound like an army moving in circles around you. Commanders use night noise to keep defenders awake and jumpy. Sleep loss makes fear sharper and discipline weaker. Sometimes the goal is exhaustion. not battle. A simple trick is to sound bigger than you are. Horns from multiple ridges suggest encirclement, even if the ridges are empty. Scouts report movement that might be carts, not troops. Defenders spend morale preparing for a giant that isn't there. Fear is paid in advance. Some instruments are weapons because they are impossible to ignore. Bagpipes and similar loud pipes cut through chaos and announce confidence. They tell your side, we're still organized, and tell the enemy, we're not scared. That confidence can be contagious, and contagion moves crowds. In fear warfare, confidence is counter-fear. Encirclement is terrifying because it deletes exits. Sound can create the encirclement feeling before any troops arrive. If soldiers believe they are trapped, they stop thinking about winning and start thinking about escaping. Escape is rarely orderly, so commanders build the no-exit sensation with signals. Intimidation is not free. Noise announces where you are and where you are going. If the enemy stays calm, your loud approach becomes predictability. Overuse can even spook your own troops when silence suddenly falls. The key is control, not volume. Noise hits the body, but the next fear tool hits the eyes. If sound says we are many, scale says we are unstoppable. Across history, commanders used animals, masks, and towering silhouettes to feel monstrous without needing magic. In the next act, we meet the most famous scale weapon, war elephants. The goal is panic, not slaughter. Elephants were not just muscle. They were a moving nightmare. From far away, their size rewrote the battlefield in the defender's mind. Even if an elephant never reaches you, the fear of it can fracture a line early. Commanders relied on that early fracture. Scale is a weapon that starts at the horizon. Elephant corpse amplified awe with bells, cloth armor, and bright decorations. Not because decoration kills, but because it magnifies presence. Every jingle becomes a countdown. Something huge is approaching. Fear turns that jingle into imagined impact. The weapon is the performance. Dense formations are strong against arrows and spears, but they are weak against panic, because panic needs room and gets none. When a tight line flinches, it jams itself like a clogged machine. Elephants and other spectacles exploit that jam. The fear weapon is a traffic jam in armor. Some warriors designed fear into appearance. Samurai menpo masks and dramatic helmets turned a human face into a fierce symbol. The goal was to project calm ferocity and make opponents hesitate. Hesitation is time, and time is advantage. A scary face can be a weapon without moving. Banners are portable landmarks, but they also create giant silhouettes. A tall standard on a ridge looks like an entire army's spine. Commanders use that spine to convince enemies the line would not break. If the enemy believes you are unbreakable, they break themselves. That's fear by perception management. Rituals and paint can unify a group's identity. To the enemy, that unity can feel inhuman, like a single organism. The goal is to reduce the opponent's belief that negotiation or intimidation will work on you. A unit that looks possessed looks harder to stop. Animals react to fear cues too. A loud, strange shape can spook horses, and spooked horses spook riders. That creates a cascade where control slips away before combat starts. Fear weapons often aim at the most reactive link in the system. Once control slips, everything feels bigger and worse. Disciplined armies learn to shrink fear with procedure. Clear signals, steady spacing, and leadership posture interrupt the panic chain. The monster becomes an object again, not a prophecy. That's why veteran units look unbothered by spectacle. They replace imagination with routine. Spectacle weapons can be hard to control. A frightened elephant can panic and become chaos for its own side. That risk forces handlers and commanders to invest in control routines. Fear tools are always double-edged. If you lose control, noise and scale work best when the enemy can't verify what they see. That makes night the perfect multiplier. In the next act, we follow fear technology into darkness. Torches, flares, smoke, and false shadows. Night turns every signal into a question, and questions breed fear. At night, your brain becomes a projector. A few torches behind a ridge can look like thousands moving. Commanders use torch patterns to inflate their size. Defenders then waste morale preparing for the worst version of reality. Darkness makes exaggeration cheap. Sudden light steals night vision and steals confidence. Fire pots and flares were used to startle, distract, and reveal silhouettes at the worst moment. The goal wasn't to burn people, it was to force mistakes and hesitation. A startled unit moves badly. Bad movement becomes panic. Smoke is a visibility weapon. If you can hide your movement, the enemy imagines movement everywhere. That makes leaders feel helpless because they can't confirm threats. A helpless leader loses authority, and the unit loses coordination. Smoke turns uncertainty into fear fuel. Fake campfires are cheap decoys. They draw attention like magnets because fire feels like certainty. While defenders stare at the flames, real movement happens elsewhere. Fear grows when you realize you watched the wrong thing, and that realization arrives as shame. In a siege, sleep becomes a battlefield. Alarm gongs and distant shouting can keep defenders waking up repeatedly. Repeated waking makes every rumor feel true. A tired city argues more and trusts less. The fear weapon is exhaustion delivered by sound. In darkness, a single shout can redirect thousands. A false breach rumor can send crowds to the wrong gate. That creates bottlenecks that block real defenders from moving. Fear turns streets into traffic jams. Sometimes panic is a bigger enemy than the attacker. Fireworks were not only celebration, they could be intimidation. A sudden thunder crack in the dark feels supernatural, even when it's chemistry. Commanders used controlled bursts to suggest advanced power and unstoppable momentum. The enemy imagines the next burst landing on them, and imagination does the work. In the 20th century, searchlights became the new torches. A beam can pin people psychologically. You feel seen, hunted, and helpless. Even without bullets, the beam changes behavior. Heads down, movement slow. The fear weapon is exposure. Night becomes a stage where the attacker controls the spotlight. Defenders adapted with discipline. Light discipline, quiet movement, and pre-planned signals reduce the attacker's advantage. When everyone knows the routine, a sudden flare is less shocking. This is the system lesson. Reduce uncertainty. Reduce fear. Fear hates prepared minds. Night tricks set the stage for a special category of fear weapon, eerie sounds. When the sound is unfamiliar, the brain labels it danger instantly. In the next act, we explore whistling arrows, howling rockets, and other tools designed to scare through sound signatures. They don't need to hit to work. They just need to be heard. Some arrows were built to sing, not slice. Whistling heads create an eerie incoming sound that steals focus. Even if the arrow lands harmlessly, the sound makes people duck and break formation. Breaking formation is often the real goal. Fear weaponry turns attention into a liability. In some traditions, special whistling arrows were also ritual signals. They announced the start of action and felt like fate arriving on a string. That symbolic weight makes fear heavier than physics. Opponents don't just hear a whistle, they hear a story. Stories can terrify faster than speed. Early rockets and fireworks could be used as psychological shock. A howling launch sound implies a weapon beyond your experience. Even when accuracy is poor, fear is accurate. Defenders imagine the worst landing everywhere, so they move, often into worse positions. Some fear tools attack the senses directly. Loud bangs, choking smells, sudden smoke. The aim is not death but disorientation and disgust. When you can't breathe comfortably, you can't think calmly. Discomfort turns into panic when you believe it will worsen. A commander can win space just by making it unpleasant. Some weapons don't kill. They make movement feel dangerous. Caltrops and spikes force slow steps and careful eyes. That slows pursuit, breaks momentum, and injects anxiety into every stride. Fear of the ground changes tactics without a fight. It's intimidation by uncertainty underfoot. Fire changes psychology because it spreads on its own. Fire arrows and flaming signals make people fear what they can't control. Even a small flame can feel like a future inferno. So defenders focus on stopping fire rather than holding position. A fear weapon wins by redirecting attention. Across cultures, eerie whistles and horns were used to sound other. When a sound doesn't match what you know, the brain labels it threat. Massed whistles can feel like a screaming wind even without contact. The point is to make defenders hesitate or flee before engagement. Fear thrives on unfamiliarity. Sound signatures combine perfectly with deception. If whistles or rockets come from multiple directions, the mind paints a surround. Defenders then split forces to cover imaginary threats. Splitting creates weakness, and weakness creates more fear. The system feeds itself. Fear tools lose power when opponents understand them. Veterans learn that whistle means distraction, not doom. Once the pattern is known, the sound becomes information, not terror. That's why fear weapons often rely on novelty. And novelty runs out. Noise and spectacle reach the senses, but messages reach belief. Once communication technology improves, fear can be delivered to thousands at once. Leaflets, loudspeakers, and radio turn surrender into a script. In the next act, intimidation becomes mass-produced. The weapon is the message. Leaflets are psychological artillery, cheap, repeatable, and everywhere. They don't need to convince everyone, only enough to create a crack. A single rumor-like promise can dissolve trust in leadership. Even when the paper is blank in our visuals, the delivery is pressure. Fear arrives like snow. Loudspeakers turn battle into an unwanted conversation. They can mention real places and real fears, making soldiers feel watched. Even simple messages hit harder when they sound personal. The goal is to make people doubt the people next to them. Doubt is a solvent for cohesion. Radio extends fear beyond the front line. It can infect rest time with anxiety time. Propaganda doesn't need full belief. It only needs uncertainty. Leaders then waste energy cleaning up rumors instead of planning. Fear becomes a maintenance problem. The strongest fear messages combine senses. A searchlight beam says, "We can find you," while a loudspeaker says, "We understand you." Together they create helplessness, which is fear's favorite feeling. Helpless soldiers make quick decisions to end the discomfort. That's why surrender corridors feel tempting. Promises can be fear weapons too. A safe corridor encourages individuals to peel away from the group. Once a few leave, the unit's cohesion cracks like a dry rope. The attacker wins without chasing. The weapon is controlled hope. Fear messaging targets weak points, not averages. New recruits, exhausted units, and lonely sentries are easier to bend. Propaganda isolates them inside their own head. Once isolated, surrender feels like relief. This is fear as segmentation strategy. If soldiers distrust leaders, the army dissolves from the inside. Propaganda attacks legitimacy, hoarding, abandonment, betrayal. Even false accusations force leaders to defend themselves. Defense consumes attention and time. Fear turns inward. Armies fought back with clarity and cohesion. Honest briefings shrink unknowns, and humor shrinks threat size. Shared identity makes lonely soldiers feel held by the group. This doesn't delete fear, but it blocks fear's pathways. Counter fear is a process. Sometimes surrender happens without a shot. That can look like weakness, but it often means exhaustion and isolation were already present. Fear weapons harvest weakness. They don't create it from nothing. The result is efficient and ethically complicated. It ends danger for some and begins consequences for others. Fear messaging can also backfire. If the enemy holds firm, your threats lose credibility. Worse, your own troops may absorb the same doubt and feel morally stained. When fear is your main tool, you become dependent on it. Next, we see what happens when fear tools boomerang. Fear is contagious on both sides of the line. If a spectacle goes wrong, your own troops can panic too. Panic turns coordination into collisions and jams. A commander then fights two enemies, the opponent and their own movement. Fear boomerangs hardest when control is weak. A fear weapon can become a crutch. If you believe the enemy will always flinch, you stop preparing for resistance. That creates brittle plans that shatter when the enemy holds. Then surprise flips sides. Intimidation without strategy is a gamble. When troops rely on drums and spectacle to feel brave, silence becomes frightening. A sudden quiet can make them think something is wrong. That's an internal vulnerability built by the fear tool itself. The weapon changes the user's psychology too. Every tool shapes the hand. Elephants could terrify the enemy, but also terrify the handlers if they spooked. A panicked animal is a moving hazard, even without showing harm. That risk made elephant warfare expensive in training and control. The fear weapon demanded a fear management system. Without that system, it collapses. Fear can also create defiance. When people feel bullied, some refuse to comply on principle. That turns intimidation into a recruitment tool for resistance. The attacker then must escalate to maintain fear, and escalation increases cost. Fear becomes an addiction with withdrawal. Threats only work if believed. If the attacker cannot follow through, the myth collapses. Once the myth collapses, fear flips sides, and confidence rises for defenders. This is why fear weapons are chained to real capability. Bluffing is a fragile strategy. Even successful fear tactics can injure the user's morale. If your army must terrify to win, it may feel ashamed or cynical. That moral fatigue reduces discipline over time. A fearful society can't build trust easily. The bill arrives later, but it arrives. One way to defeat intimidation is to shrink it with humor. When defenders laugh at the monster loses size. Humor restores breathing and restores thinking. That makes the fear tool waste energy. Confidence becomes contagious again. Fear weapons are powerful because they hijack human shortcuts. But power without governance becomes chaos. Commanders who use intimidation must control it, measure it, and stop it when it backfires. Otherwise, they create instability on their own side. If fear can be designed, resistance to fear can be designed too. The strongest defense is not heroic yelling. It's routines, cohesion, and clarity. That's what the final act explores. Counter-fear systems that keep groups functional under intimidation. When the mind stays organized, the fear weapon fails. When fear spikes, thinking narrows. Drill gives the body a script that runs even when the mind is noisy. That script converts panic into procedure. Procedure preserves formation and preserves options. Isolation is fear's favorite condition. Buddy systems fight isolation by making every soldier someone's responsibility. Buddies catch panic early and pull each other back into the group. That creates a network of micro-stabilizers. A networked unit breaks slower. Fear grows in information gaps. Clear signals shrink those gaps. Rally points, hand signs, and redundant messengers. When signals are practiced, they feel like certainty. Certainty keeps people moving correctly. Correct movement is the enemy of panic. Fear speeds breathing and speeds mistakes. Leaders slow the tempo, short commands, steady rhythm, controlled pauses. When tempo slows, the mind catches up to reality. Reality is usually less terrifying than imagination. Tempo control is fear control. Intimidation thrives on attention. A counter rule is simple. Don't feed the spectacle. Focus eyes on tasks, not threats. Focus minds on next steps, not horror stories. This is attention discipline. It turns fear from a leader into background noise. Fake orders and false signals work when truth is fragile. Verification routines add redundancy. 2 scouts, 2 messengers, 1 confirmed decision. Redundancy makes deception expensive. When deception is expensive, fear tools lose speed. And speed is what fear depends on. Hope is the opposite of inevitability. Small wins, holding a point, receiving supplies, seeing allies, restore hope quickly. That hope raises the morale meter and makes fear tools bounce off. Commanders defend morale by defending hope cues. A hopeful unit is hard to terrify. Fear can win quickly, but it leaves a bill. Trust takes longer to rebuild than walls or weapons. That's why leaders who choose fear should be judged by the aftermath, not the moment. History shows the pattern again and again. Shortcuts have costs. Weapons designed to terrify succeed by changing decisions. They turn attention into distraction, uncertainty into panic, and hesitation into surrender. But they can backfire, and they always leave moral and social residue. The best defense is not pretending fear doesn't exist. It's building routines that keep fear from steering. That's courage by design. If you want more system-first history in Tiny Titan style, you're in the right place. Subscribe for stories where psychology, incentives, and design change outcomes before the clash. Fear is powerful when it's invisible. Understanding it makes it smaller. See you in the next episode.